It was a golden opportunity to change the narrative, but ultimately Desmond Ridder came up short. I review the All-22 of the Falcons Week 14 loss. We'll break it down on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/locked on to get started. And guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. Drew. Been covering the Falcons for so long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. And I appreciate each and every one of you guys, that especially those of you that were OGs on falcfans.com, that were visiting that website, all five of you, and are still listening to this illustrious podcast each and every day. Shout out to the everydayers, especially the OGs. And if you want to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is an all-22 review of the Falcons Week 14 loss to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Later in the episode, we'll talk about Clark Phillips, his performance, and some of the defensive scheme changes we saw in this game, some new wrinkles that Ryan Nielsen's sort of mixing into things. We'll answer some mailbag questions about whether or not Arthur Smith's scheme is limited and whether or not the Falcons' talent may be a tad bit overrated. But we'll start off talking about Desmond Ridder and the play calling in this game. Let's start with the play calling, right? And as I suspected watching the game live, I didn't have any notable issues with Arthur Smith's play calling after reviewing the film in this game, right? You know, one thing that did stand out with his play calling was the Falcons ran that unbalanced sort of zone read option play a couple of times in this game, and that was the play that they ran on that fourth down against the Saints that got stuffed early in that game. It was also the play that Ridder scored a touchdown on against the Bucs, and so it was kind of like Arthur Smith maybe being like, hey, you guys thought I was being too cute when I ran that 2 weeks ago, you know, F you. We're going to score off of it this week. But, you know, I also thought one of the things I was concerned with going into the game was how would Arthur Smith adjust his play calling to deal with some of the offensive line weaknesses, right? And I thought he did a pretty good job doing that. He used rollouts, he used some quick game. And when they did have longer developing routes, some of those shot plays, they typically went max protect to prevent those guys by being put in a bad situation. So, we also talk about the tendency to call passes versus the run game. I didn't have a problem with that. When they did run outside zone in this game, as I suspected it would be, it was a problem for both of the team's tackles. You know, I thought Storm Norton did a better job when the team asked him to be more of that downhill gap inside zone run blocker. I also thought Ryan Nielsen played pretty well for the offensive line. I only really noticed watching the film one bad play from him in this game. And so it felt like the drop off from Drew Dahlman to Nuzul in this game was minimal at this point. Meanwhile, the drop off from Jake Matthews to Tyler Vrabel and Caleb McGarry to Storm Norton were significant, and that led to some of the question marks, I think, with the Falcons relying on their passing game and some of the things that Arthur Smith did to make sure that didn't hold back this offense from a protection standpoint. There was only really one play in this game where I felt like protection really kind of ruined that play. But talking about Desmond Ridder, you know, I thought Ridder was fine. He wasn't horrible in this game, right? You know, I wasn't criticizing him earlier this week because I thought he stunk or anything like that. He just missed throws, right? And we needed him to make those throws, right? There were too many questionable decisions and throws in this game. Pro Football Focus had him with 3 turnover-worthy plays. I put it at 4, right? I'm guessing they didn't count the safety as a turnover-worthy play, but I did. But the shortcomings of this team weren't solely on him, right? In the third quarter, especially, there were a couple of times there were too many drops, right? That third quarter pass where he threw to Drake London, to me, was a dime that Kayvon Merriweather wound up sort of knocking it out of Drake London's hands as he was going to the ground. That was a beautiful throw. That was a big time throw. That was a perfect throw. This was probably one of the 5 best throws that Desmond Ridder's made all year long. So there were moments in this game. And that's part of the reason why, even though I'm, over it, I guess you could say, to use the words I used the other day. Like, I'm not completely out and giving up on Desmond Ridder. I still think he has the capability of being a capable starter in this league. He's just got to clean things up. But what it really was this Bucs game was kind of a crossroads where you had these sort of three boxes that were checked that led to me having expectations for Ridder in this game. And he didn't live up to those expectations. Those three boxes were, you had a game plan, as we've discussed, that was likely going to lean on the passing game rather than a run game, as we have seen throughout this season. You were playing at home, where we know Ridder is way better, and you were going up against a defense that we've seen Ridder show he can, pick apart, so to speak, relatively speaking. And it's unlikely that you're going to have any of those boxes, or at least, more than one of those boxes checked at any other point for the remainder of the season. That's why this game was sort of like a crucial nexus, a crossroads for all of that to come together for Ridder to have that sort of showcase game, right? Because of the four remaining games, three of those are road games, right? Where we know Ridder typically does not perform well. Two of those are against defenses in Carolina and Indianapolis that are much better pass defenses than they are run defenses. So it's likely that their game plan, depending on what metric you look at, both of those teams have like bottom 5 or bottom 10 run defenses. The game plan is probably going to lean on the running game against those teams, especially given that it's on the road, right? Assuming that the Falcons are healthy up front and all that stuff, right? And then you go to the other road game against the Saints, right? No, I'm sorry. Indianapolis is a home game, right? Sorry, I got my wires crossed. Indianapolis is a home game, but the Saints is a road game, right? And of course, that's going to be another game where you're going to probably rely on the ground attack due to the success that we had doing that in week 12. And so your other remaining game is a road game, right? That is actually, the Bears, they're vulnerable through the air. But if AccuWeather.com can be believed, right, and probably shouldn't be believed, but it seems like there's a decent chance that on that weekend where we play in Chicago, it might snow, right? Decent chance that it might snow. So probably not going to be able to attack the Bears, vulnerable pass defense as effectively as you would like to be. So that's why I say, like, this Bucs game was kind of a showcase game. It was the type of game that you wanted Ridder to come through, and so that maybe, assuming the Falcons can find a way to, make the playoffs this year, maybe it gives you 20% more confidence that, hey, maybe not you're going to win a playoff game, but maybe you can be a little bit more competitive because we saw Ridder sort of put the team on his back against the Bucs. And so maybe we can see him do that for a quarter or two if need be against, whoever we face in the postseason, right? And it would give you that sort of confidence going into next year that, okay, this is what we built up to late in the season, and not how you start, how you finish. Ridder got better as the season wore on. He started to be more of the engine behind the offense, and that's something that you can build off of in 2024 should Ridder continue to be the starter. So that's what this game to me, and that's why this game was important. Now, season's not over. All right. Falcons still have, depending on what website you look at and whose odds, it's like a 30 to 40% chance of making the playoffs this year. So, right even with the Bucs, Saints, it's basically, 33, 33, 34 in terms of who's going to win this division. Right. So it's not over, and Ridder could play well and this team could play well. Right. These final 4 games, Ridder could go out being more of this game manager type that we're talking about, the likelihood that the game plan's going to call for him. And maybe he does that at a really high level, throws 7 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. And then we're having a different conversation about Desmond Ridder and this team potentially a month from now. But the reality of the situation is the next time that you're going to need Desmond Ridder to kind of carry you, if, what I just said proves to be accurate, is going to be in the postseason when you're hosting either the Eagles or the Cowboys at home, right? Where you check that box in your game plan. You're probably not going to be able to run the ball 50 times against those defenses. Maybe, who knows? But you're probably going to need your quarterback to do a lot more heavy lifting against those teams. And, asking the Falcons to drop back 40 times against, Micah Parsons, good luck with that. And then while the Eagles defense has fallen back down to earth the last 6 weeks, I think that D-line, similar to what we talked about 2 weeks ago with the Jets, matches up very well against the Falcons offensive line. So I'm not feeling great about dropping back to throw 40 times against them, even if that seems like a more, that seems better than, doing that against the Cowboys. So, all that to say, I don't think the sky is falling. I don't think all is lost or anything when it comes to this season or Desmond Ridder or the Falcons or anything. But basically, what I'm trying to explain to you guys is there's no real compelling reason for me to buy into Ridder for the rest of the year, right? You know, we would have gotten that had he done what I wanted him to do against the Bucs. Right now, again, maybe he and the team plays well down the stretch, but I'm not going to complain about the Falcons, playing well and winning games, right? But speaking about complaining about players playing well, let's talk about Clark Phillips, right? Let's talk about some of the schematic changes that the Falcons unveiled in this game against the Bucs, including their dollar defense, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the weather might be getting colder, and it might be especially cold in a couple of weeks in Chicago, but the NFL offers are staying hot over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with a winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. And if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on that action. It's an app that's safe. It's easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options. You can bet money line, the straight up bets. You can bet spreads, right? The Falcons are -3, 3-point favorites against the Panthers this week. You can bet player props, over unders, all that and more. So visit FanDuel.com/locked on so that you can stay warm and cozy this winter. FanDuel is an official partner of the NFL. So as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming YouTube channel, the first of its kind, giving you all the breakdowns on the big leagues, national stories, local experts, all that stuff and more. Check out Locked On Sports Today. Check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, their 24/7 streaming channel as well, to get the local insight right here in the state of Georgia. But let's talk about the Falcons defense, and this is based off of my charting of the defense. The Falcons played mostly man in this game. We talked about how they played predominantly zone against the Bucs in that week 7 matchup. Based off my charting, 55% of their coverage snaps were man coverage. That's the most man coverage, the highest percentage of man coverage they have played since week 4 this year, right? They predominantly played 2-man under or cover 5, which is a too high shell with man coverage underneath. And it makes sense, because if you were concerned about your ability to match up with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin on the outside, as we were, right, you would want to give those outside corners, especially safety, help by playing those too high shells. Now, of course, Jesse Bates throws a wrench into that plan, because Jesse Bates is a cheater, as I discussed on last week's episode, and he did absolutely left a couple of guys out to dry on those too high shells, right, including that go ball between to Chris Godwin in the second quarter, where Clark Phillips was in good coverage on that go ball. He should have had safety help over the top, but Jesse Bates is like, nope, I'm hunting for turnovers, right? But speaking of Clark Phillips, he played well, right? And he played much better than I thought he would, playing in such a man-heavy scheme as the Falcons deployed on Sunday against the Bucs. And especially when you consider that he's lining up against Chris Godwin, who, not that long ago we considered to be one of the 10 to 12 best wide receivers in the game, right? It's especially impressive, right? Now, Phillips wasn't perfect in that regard. There were a couple of times where they had him in press man coverage and Godwin beat him clean off the line. But it's Chris Godwin, so I'm going to give him somewhat a pass on that. But I want to get those positives out of the way, because now I gotta pee in that punch bowl, as I so often do, right? Because I want to give him credit, because they asked him to do a thing that I didn't think he could do at a high level, and he did a pretty good job doing, right? And so my biggest issue about Clark Phillips when we drafted him is, could he hold up in a man-heavy scheme? And that, to me, is less of an issue today than I thought it was 6 months ago when we were talking about that, breaking him down on that Scouting Report episode back in late May or early June, whenever we did that. But I still have issues, right? When I look at Clark Phillips over especially these last 2 games, right? He's missed a lot of tackles, 5 in the last 2 games. If you look at PFF's missed tackle rate, that's a rate of 36%, right? And if you look at the starting cornerback with the worst tackling rate in the NFL, currently in the NFL, that's Byron Murphy with the Vikings, and that's 25%. So essentially, what that's telling you, at this current rate, Clark Phillips is one of the worst tackling corners in the NFL. So that's a concern. He also has to clean up the penalties, right? He has 3 coverage penalties in 3 games, playing just about 160 snaps. And I was curious, was that something, okay, is that just typical among young cornerbacks that they tend to get flagged early in their careers and that's not something worthwhile? So I look back at a lot of past Falcons over the last decade that we've drafted over the last decade, right? And I wanted to compare them to how many snaps they had played before they got their 3rd coverage penalty, looking at DPIs, pass interference, holding calls, illegal contacts, those types of plays. And again, Clark Phillips has played 163 snaps with 3 penalties. Robert Alford, 250 snaps. Kendall Sheffield, 300 snaps. Isaiah Oliver, about 360 snaps. Both Jalen Collins and Desmond Trufant were about 500 snaps. D. Alford was about 700 snaps. AJ Terrell about 900 snaps before they got that 3rd penalty. And so basically what that's telling you is Clark Phillips is getting penalized so far, at a rate twice as high as Robert Alford and Kendall Sheffield, 2 of the more undisciplined corners that the Falcons have had over the last decade when it comes to penalties, and 4 times the rate of the guy that potentially you would expect him to push for a starting spot next year in the nickel in D. Alford. So while I'm going to give him credit for, better man coverage than I thought, these are also reasons why it still gives me some pause about, why I'm not going to be necessarily as high on Clark Phillips right now yet. I want to give the caveat based off of today, as maybe others will be based off of this performance, because, all 3 of those penalties came when he was in man coverage, right? And then you couple that with, if you're going to play man coverage and you give up a reception, you got to tackle your guy. And so tackling matters, right? So I'm sure that the Discord is going to go crazy over that one, me hating on Clark Phillips. So enjoy that one, guys. But the other thing I want to talk about before we move on with the defense was the Falcons unveiled their dollar defense against the Bucs. And we talked about this back after the week 3 game, when we talked about the different names and different fronts when it came to dime defense. And right, dime is 6 defensive backs on the field. And you had 2 different sort of fronts, right? Traditional front, which is a 4-1, 4 down linemen, 1 linebacker, dime defense. And then what the Falcons wanted to unveil, but haven't used as frequently as they would like to due to Troy Anderson's injury and concerns about Nate Landman's coverage ability, right? Which is the Ruby defense, which is a 3-2 front, 3 down linemen, 2 linebackers, right? Now, at that time, we mentioned one alternative name for the Ruby defense is a dollar defense, right? Some people call that the dollar. The 3-2-6 is dollar. But I said on that episode that my first introduction to the term dollar defense was the Packers a couple of years back using 7 defensive backs. And thus, that's what I'm now referring to this dollar defense as, where the Falcons against the Bucs on a handful of plays put 7 DBs on the field, their traditional 3 corners, 3 safeties, and Trey Flowers as that 7th defensive back. Now, what Trey Flowers did predominantly on these plays was play close to the line of scrimmage, and he was basically tasked with covering the running back out of the backfield, right? And that 31-yard screen pass to Rashawn White that scored in this game was the Falcons playing dollar. Trey Flowers got blocked out of that play. DeMarco Hellams also got blocked out of downfield, and Jesse Bates took a bad angle and missed the tackle, and that's what led to that touchdown. But the front that they used in that dollar was a 3-1, right? A 3-1-7 defense, and Caden Ellis being that 4th rusher, that linebacker, that sole linebacker. So it was effective at getting pressure. They were using a lot of stunts, and Ellis got pressure. Ebiketie got pressure a couple of times. So it's something that, is intriguing, right? So when we talk about Ryan Nielsen, we've been talking about this since the bye week in these all-22 breakdowns, is like Ryan Nielsen's mixing in new flavors on the back end since the bye week, right? Not only do you have the regular nickel with the 5 defensive backs, but we've seen more big nickel in the last 3 games, right? Where that slot defender, instead of being a corner, is a safety, right? We've seen, a mix of both Ruby and traditional dime defense. And now we're seeing the dollar. So there's a chance, let's say in February when we're reviewing the defense or reviewing the safety position or talking about, some potential free agent targets or whatever. And you might hear me say, oh, that guy would be a great dollar player, right? He'd be a great fit in that dollar role in the Falcons defense, should they want to expand the usage of that position, next season. And so, if you're an everydayer, like you'll understand that reference 2 months from now, So continue to be an everydayer. But we're going to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, answering some mailbag questions, some listener questions about some of the limitations of Arthur Smith's scheme and whether or not the Falcons have as much talent as they reputedly have. And if they do, why are they struggling on offense? So we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But first, I want to tell you about Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports, because now that basketball season is here, they have unveiled their specials leagues where you can combine projections across sports, across leagues, right? If you're doing it on Tuesday night, what about Steph Curry combining his with Nikita Kucherov's and combined on 3 points made in shots on goal? If you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $250 with Prize Picks. It's simple to play. Just pick two or more players, pick more or less than their projected stats. It's you versus the projections, not you versus any players. And the more entries you make, the more money you can make, up to 25 times your money. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and enormous selection of players and stat types is why Prize Picks is the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL in lowercase for your first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use promo code LockedOnNFL in lowercase. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports made easy. So as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, I do want to plug the Locked On Falcons insiders who will get access to an extended All-22 review. We'll break down Clark Phillips. I didn't get my reel of him last week up. So we'll add the Jets plays and the Bucs plays to that reel, and you can judge for yourself if I'm being too critical of Clark Phillips. We'll break down some Ridder plays, some other things that popped out on film. And if you want to get access to that, all you got to do is hit the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. It's a 14-day free trial. Then it's $4.99 a month after that. So, you can try it out for the next two All-22 reviews. And if you like it, keep subscribing. If you don't, no harm, no foul. And of course, in addition to that extended All-22 review, you will also get access, the one-on-one access to me. So you can provide your feedback and you can tell me I'm hating too much on Clark Phillips, and you can tell me why I need to go harder on Clark Phillips. Whatever floats your boat, that's all for you. But, you also get priority when it comes to some of these mailbag questions. So we have two questions from the Locked On Falcons insiders. Our first one comes from Nigel. He asks, he says, it seems like Arthur Smith's offense is not QB friendly. To me, it feels like the offense is more about guys winning their matchups than scheming someone open. What's your opinion on a system being QB friendly, and is Arthur Smith's offense more difficult than it needs to be on this quarterback? So I think what you're referring to, Nigel, is what I've talked about in the past, which is intentionality, right? Meaning that, do the result of the play, did you intend for that to happen, right? Did you design that? Did you scheme that up? For example, like we talked about with the explosive plays in the offense, that oftentimes with Arthur Smith, and I think this is what you're talking about, guys winning their matchups, it's a guy being a dude, right? It's, if you handed this ball off to Damian Williams, he'd get 4 yards, but you hand it off to Bijan or Derrick Henry and he turns it into 20 yards, right? That's, I think, what you're getting at. And I understand that. We've talked about that a ton, right? Now, especially when it comes to explosive plays. Now, and we've talked about the quote unquote lack of intentionality under Arthur Smith, in contrast to someone like Kyle Shanahan, where intentionality in terms of dialing up explosive plays was something that was a near weekly occurrence with his offense here in Atlanta, and certainly is there in San Francisco. Now, there is some intentionality in Arthur Smith's offense. It's maybe not as regular as we would ideally like it to be, nor is it, the sort of deep plays, the explosive plays, right? Most of it, when, like, for example, when Arthur Smith likes to dial up an explosive play, it's usually going to involve a receiver running like a deep post or something, like just go deep and we'll throw it to you, right? And there were a number of those plays against the Bucs where they took some of those deep shots where it was clearly designed to play was, go to Scotty Miller deep, go to Drake London deep, etc., right? And when you look at the intentionality that Arthur Smith does have in his offense, a lot of it is sort of underneath intermediate type of plays, right? Finding the soft spot in the zone on a 6-yard hitch or slant or something like that. Some of the dagger and smash concepts that we've broken down in the past and extended All-22 reviews that I know, Nigel, you've been privy to, that we've talked about Ridder being, very good at executing and operating those sort of concepts. Those are sort of those intermediate ones. So those are scheming guys open, but it isn't quite the same as it is, scheming, Tevin Coleman for a 26-yard play or Julio Jones for a 45-yard play or something like that we saw on a semi-regular basis, 7-8 years ago. But, I think the scheme does get guys open to an adequate level. Certainly, could he do more? Absolutely. Would that make it QB friendlier? Yes. But I don't think it's because this scheme is not very QB friendly, right? I don't think it's holding things back, right? I've used a comparison before, or Arthur Smith is like the Kirk Cousins of play calling, right? Right. And like, if you compare Arthur Smith as a play caller or Kirk Cousins to other quarterbacks, right? If you compare him to most of the play callers or most of the quarterbacks in the NFL, right? Kirk Cousins and Arthur Smith look pretty good, right? But if you compare him to the best play callers or the best quarterbacks in the NFL, then Kirk Cousins comes up very short, and Arthur Smith in that same regard. So I hope that provides some clarity there, Nigel. Now, our next question comes from another insider who asked this basically after I rewatched the game yesterday and sent this out to the other insiders, saying, this is what I said. I still don't have a major problem with Arthur Smith's play calling in this game. Feels like one of the better called games he's had all year long. I think that held up under scrutiny to the All-22 review. But then David replied, what's the problem then? We have all the talent needed to score points minus yesterday's injuries. Is it scheme, coaching, or players? How can we be scoring so few points with so much apparent talent? Who's to blame then? So the answer to your question, David, to skip to the end, it's turnovers and to a slightly lesser extent, the quarterback. I don't want to put it all on Desmond Ridder, right? Because I don't like playing the blame game because, as we talked with Joe Patrick of 92.9 Game a couple of weeks ago, that whole scapegoat thing. But like we've talked a bunch this year about, in this game alone, there was like 10 plus points that were left on the board because of mistakes and whatnot. Other games where there's been 2 scores, 23 scores, right? Because the Falcons turned the ball over in the red zone and whatnot. So I think that's really it. If you want to blame something, it's just they don't execute as well as they need to. Now, again, you can blame that on coaching, sure. If players need to execute better, well, the coaching is holding them back. Okay, if that's what you want to believe, but that tends to be very nebulous because it's like, okay, what specifically, you know what I'm saying? Like it's just hard to really nail it down. So, when we talk about the scheme, as I said, I don't think the scheme is really holding them back. Now, I don't think this is a scheme that's, going to score 30 to 40 points every single week, right? Again, going back to that lack of intentionality in the offense, but there's nothing that says that this scheme shouldn't score 24 to 30 points pretty regularly. Now, when we come to the talent issue, I think the talent is somewhat overrated, right? Talent to me is basically what we talked about earlier with like Derrick Henry and Julio Jones. Is like, just get that ball in that guy's hands and let him wreck defense. Now, Bijan has that level of talent, but it hasn't been consistently on display because he's probably a rookie, right? And other circumstances around him. I have no qualms about Bijan's performance this year. You look at Drake London, right? Drake London's coming off an incredible game, mossing dudes, but he doesn't perform at that level every single week. You'll get a handful of games every year where Drake London plays at this level, but you can't expect him to be on the same level as Julio Jones or Calvin Johnson, who could theoretically do that every single week, right? With Drake London, like 50-50 balls or 60-40 balls. And that's what Drake's superpower is. But he's not a great separator. He's not a poor separator, but he's not a great separator. And when you talk about other sort of contested catch guys that aren't elite separators, right? You talk about guys like T. Higgins and Kenny Golladay and Mike Williams, right? Guys that aren't true number ones or high level number twos, right? And then you look at when those guys are playing their best football, look at the quarterbacks throwing to them: Joe Burrow, Matt Stafford, Justin Herbert. And then you look at the one wide receiver one that we do compare Drake to, that's similar type of player, is Michael Thomas, right? And then look at the quarterback who was throwing him the ball during his peak years in Drew Brees. So that's a part of the conversation. Then you look at Kyle Pitts, right? One of the more talented tight ends in the NFL, but 50-50 balls with Kyle Pitts are really 40-60 balls with him. And then Kyle Pitts is not a great yak guy either, right? And this isn't revisionist history, right? But I talked about these exact two deficiencies when we did his scouting report breakdown 2.5 years ago. Basically, Kyle Pitts in a lot of ways is very similar to Darren Waller, and Darren Waller is a very good tight end, right? If anybody's sitting here saying that Darren Waller's bad, like, they don't know ball, right? Darren Waller is one of the rare tight ends that can win at all 3 levels: short, intermediate, and deep, right? Kyle Pitts is the same way. But the problem is with me pointing that out is there's going to be a couple of knuckleheads in the comments, Discord, elsewhere. They're going to use that for ammo for their agendas, that why one of these 3 guys, Bijan, Drake, and Pitts, because I've heard it all with all 3 of them, wasn't worth a top 10 pick because they have this warped worldview, right? Where if you're only as good as insert perennial Pro Bowl player, you're not worth a top 10 pick, which is weird to me. But so I think the Falcons have talent. I don't think the talent is like elite or anything like, oh, they should just basically be able to drop 30 burgers every single week. But certainly they have more than enough talent to, be a team that can score 24 plus points pretty consistently, but they don't have the consistency because of the quarterback and the turnovers, I think, at this point in time. So I hope that answers your question, David. If you had sort of Kyle Shanahan as your play caller, right? Some of these mistakes, the quarterback play, the turnovers would be less backbreaking, right? Because one of the things about Kyle Shanahan was like, you can take those negative plays because the next play, like if I lose 5 yards on one play, I'll get it back because I'm going to get 25 yards on the next play. When you have that sort of intentionality with the explosive plays in the play calling, but we don't have that. And so our margin for error is much thinner. Right. And so I think it's fair to criticize Arthur Smith, but at the same time, like I only think there's a handful of play callers in the league that can overcome those types of deficiencies. And so again, I don't think it's fair to basically say, gosh darn it, Arthur Smith's bad at his job because he's only good as Kirk Cousins. But that's kind of how I feel. So that's it, guys. We'll be back tomorrow with another crossover Thursday with Locked On Panthers host Julian Council, and continue to make us your first listen. That's going to do it. Appreciate it. Till then.